Today I'd like to talk about Western Canada's premier architect, Francis Rattenbury. Rattenbury's story is so phenomenal and occurred at a pivotal time in Western Canada's history. Railroads were being laid, government was organizing, Canada as a country was just born. Yet somehow the government found budget to begin a campaign of building phenomenal structures to show the province's growing economic and political status. What better way to get a super building designed than to hold a competition? This seemed to be the preferred method in the late 19th century anyhow. So Francis, a British-born, newly arrived immigrant to BC, applies for the competition to design BC's Parliament building in Victoria. When he first arrived to BC, he put an ad in the Vancouver Daily Mail announcing his arrival and credentials, saying he was trained by his uncle's business partner, Henry Francis Lockwood, even though Francis would have only been 11 years old when Lockwood died. Now, the narrative seems to be torn on whether or not Francis was really qualified to take on a project of this caliber, given he's described as receiving no formal training. It does appear that he apprenticed at his uncle's company, Lockwood and Mawson, in Leeds, England, when he was 17. He arrived in BC in 1891 at the age of 24, so it is possible he learned enough in that time, but is described as making little impact or designs of importance. But you know the story. "Uncle, no one's taking me seriously here, I'm suffocating."
"Oh, Frankie, stop whining. Go make your mark in Canada. I have some connections there. No one knows how insufferable you are yet. They'll take anyone. It's barely a country."
Anyway, so Francis wins the competition under the pseudonym a BC architect for clout and proceeds to oversee this. Now I know what you're thinking, but hold on. This is 1891 Canada. Where did they get all the builders and skilled craftsmen? How did they find the resources and people to gather the resources? Isn't Victoria on an island? Wasn't the first hydroelectric site in Victoria formed in 1898? Why would they need such a large, elaborate building for a population of 23,000? Weren't they using horse and buggy? Valid questions. Well, would it help if I told you they built this beauty in just 7 years, competition to completion, only going $400,000 over budget? So this feat got Francis a lot of attention and won him many commissions. After winning this contract, he involved himself in several financial ventures, including supplying meat and cattle to the Klondike Gold Rush prospectors, and somehow ordering 3 steam trains to service the Yukon Territory. This is possibly where his ties to the railroad originated. It pays to know a guy because shortly after, the Canadian Pacific Railway, which I'll call CPR, hired him as their Western Division architect. The railways are said to have been newly formed around this time, and the president of CPR decided railways don't only need to be for transport, but could be a tourist attraction. So the CPR actually commissioned a ton of buildings across Canada, which matched the stature of the BC Parliament. At some point he fell out with CPR and was hired by their competition, Grand Trunk Railway. But when their president, Charles Melville Hayes, went down with the Titanic, he couldn't finish the projects he set up for them. CPR lovingly welcomed him back. So during and after the Parliament, and I guess while he was selling meat, he really gets going. Let's see what our boy Frankie got up to in his 10 years as a celebrity architect. He's credited on the Road House in Vancouver, built in 1893 for Vancouver's first bookbinder, Gustav and Matilda Road. The Nanaimo Courthouse, built in 1895, along the only downtown thoroughfare that runs parallel to the waterfront. The Victoria Bank of Montreal building, built in 1896, which is now the Irish Times pub. The Nelson Bank of Montreal building, built in 1899 in Nelson, BC. Add-ons to and the second wing of the Chateau Lake Louise between 1900 and 1912, which burned down in 1924. Add-ons to the Mount Stephen House, done between 1900 and 1902, which was dismantled in 1963. Guess it had a good run. The Rossland, BC Bank of Montreal building, completed in 1900. This bank building was established due to the thriving gold mines in the area. The Lieutenant Governor's House in Victoria, BC, built in 1901, which burned down in 1957. The Victoria, BC High School on Fort Street, built in 1901, which was demolished in 1953. The hospital in the now ghost town of Phoenix, BC, built in 1901, and demolished. Burns Manor for his friend Pat Burns in Calgary, built in 1903. Mr. Burns, by the way, ran Burns Meat, but it's on the demolished list. The Empress Hotel in Victoria, built between 1903 and 1908. The Janet Clay House, built in Victoria in 1904. The Vancouver Courthouse, now the Vancouver Art Gallery, built between 1905 and 1913. The Merchants Bank Building in Victoria, built in 1907. The Nelson Courthouse in Nelson, BC, designed in 1903, but not built until 1908. The Merchants Bank Building in Nanaimo, which is now the Vault Cafe, built between 1909 and 1911. The Buntzen No. 2 Power Station in Indian Arm, BC, built in 1912, which really deserves its own video. The CPR Steamship Terminal in Victoria, built in 1924. And finally, Victoria's Crystal Garden, built in 1925. Now, that's not a complete list. There is some discussion over him being the actual architect for some buildings, and he had partners for several others as well. I want to stop here and give a bit more personal background on Francis. He was married to a nice lady named Florence in 1898, but becoming rich and famous breaks up many a marriage, and I'm sure his philandering didn't help. Despite her putting up with him and their having 2 adult children by this time, Frankie starts an affair with twice-married Alma Peckenham, a local musician whom he met at the Empress at a dinner in his honor. He goes and flaunts his affair all over town. Not only did this blatant disregard of his wife upset his colleagues and business contacts, he really proved himself an ass by shutting off Florence's heat and lights when she undoubtedly kicked him out. This was too much for the other rich guys in town, and he was shunned by the community. The other guys, at least, had the decency to hide their affairs. This led to Francis falling out of favor as Canada's architectural poster boy, and he headed back to England in shame and divorce with his new bride Alma in 1929. But believe it or not, Rattenbury's return to England may just be the most interesting part of his story in spite of all his achievements. But before I get into that, I want to talk about some of the buildings in more detail. I'll start at the start with the BC Parliament buildings. This castle was built to replace the rickety, leaky, previous Parliament buildings, lovingly dubbed the bird cages, which are described as though they were literally falling apart. How did we go from this to this? This bad boy was built over budget at a whopping $923,000, which in today's inflation equals a cool $2.89 million, which is now, coincidentally, the average price of a single-family home in Victoria today. Literally, the country started being a country like 30 years ago, and Congress's first act was to go over budget. They say they brought the granite over from Nelson Island, and it's adorned with 14 statues which were carved and designed by Schofield and Marega. Like most Parliament buildings, this place seems way too big for the needs of the time, or even today really. In person, it's absolutely domineering, and I struggle to believe they got this baby up in the time frame suggested. There are a few construction photos. On an unrelated note, the page Mind Unveiled has a great video on 19th century Photoshop, which I'll link below. Next, the Empress, equally as impressive as Parliament, but commissioned by CPR to allow railway visitors a fancy lodging on the water. Built in just 4 years and in a difficult location of reclaimed mud flats, their words, not mine, this 6-story lady has undergone at least 3 renovations in its 116-year history, totaling a whopping $109 million. In 1929, another addition was added, an expense of $2.5 million. During the Depression, she went through some hard times and had to offer her rooms as lodging to wealthy widows and residents at $1 a day just to make ends meet. It was being considered for demolition in the 60s, but survived due to public outcry. And to this day, there's a painting of Frankie Boy hanging in the halls, and it is said his ghost haunts the place. Then there's the CPR Steamship Terminal, or CPR Main Terminal, built in 1924. This is a 2-story building overlooking the Victoria Harbour. It features Greek columns and iconography. Essentially, it's a temple to the god Poseidon. In the 60s, we decided we were too cool for that old people stuff and tore down buildings, switched up the music, and had no more use of steamships. So until 1970, the terminal sat empty until Madame Tussauds Wax Museum moved in. 4 years of that happened, then in 1975, the building was sold to the province, but remained a wax museum until 2010. Fake people. Fitting. Now if you take a stroll along Victoria's Harbour, you'll see the terminal stand as an historic landmark which houses the Robert Bateman Centre, a gallery, interactive centre, and shop dedicated to the painter. Now I want to introduce the Vancouver Art Gallery, formerly Courthouse. This iconic Vancouver building was completed in 1906 through none other than a design competition. You know, I'd like to throw my hat into one of these competitions. I don't think you need much experience. The timeline I found was unclear. It seems it didn't open as a courthouse until 1911 and then was repurposed as an art museum in the 1980s. They say they imported the marble from Alaska, Tennessee, and Vermont. It was built to replace the original courthouse, but it kept the original benches and walls. This place is very beautiful, and the museum always has amazing exhibits. If you're in Vancouver, you gotta check it out. An odd one on this list, and the building that just might spark my next rant, is the Buntzen No. 2 power station in Indian Arm, BC. Built in 1912, this is the kid brother to Buntzen No. 1 Powerhouse, which was built in 1904 and not a Rattenbury. Fun fact, Powerhouse 2 is featured in the Hollywood movie It as Pennywise's lair, and I can see why. It's creepy. Historians cannot agree who built this one, but Rattenbury's name is top of the list, but it also could have been architect Robert Lyons. This project has a wild story, and I'll link an interesting article about its history below. It definitely seems like a feat of engineering, but by the 50s we were bored of it and shut her down. Have you ever been to Lake Louise? Maybe you stayed at the Chateau? Another railway building, Fairmont Group now owns all of these. I think CPR turned into a hotel chain, which turned into Fairmont, and now all these castles are Fairmont hotels. Rattenbury only built the second wing shown here. There's not too much info on the Rattenbury wing other than it burned down in 1924. Interesting fact about the chateau is that it was not winterized until 1982, which is wild because if you've ever been to Alberta, it's cold for 6 months of the year. A seasonal castle, if you will. And the last building of interest is the famous Crystal Garden in Victoria, very World's Fair inspired. It was built in 1925 as the first heated indoor saltwater swimming pool in the British Empire. It opened with a state-of-the-art heating system for year-round use. Of course, it was commissioned by CPR. It was converted into a conservatory in 1980 and now stands as an exhibition center with shops and moneymakers all around. So Francis really became something of a pop star in the architectural world and eventually designed or oversaw construction of more than 20 magnificent structures, as well as designs for various things that never panned out. It seems to me that Rattenbury was integral to the development of Western Canada, despite his moral failures. As I mentioned, his story does not end with retreating home with his tail between his legs. He's living in England with Alma, where he experienced even more financial hardships and a tendency to drink too much. That's when Alma seemingly grew bored of what we can imagine was his nonsense. The couple replied to an ad in the paper to hire 18-year-old chauffeur George Percy Stoner. Can't go without a chauffeur, money problems or not. On March 23, 1935, Francis Rattenbury was found injured in his home with multiple blows to the back of the head. He was hit so hard with a carpenter's mallet that it removed the back of his skull, and yet he didn't die until 4 days later. It turns out that Alma was busying herself with the 18-year-old chauffeur all along. So she confesses to the attack, but Stoner tells the housekeeper that actually he did it, and they're both arrested. In jail, Alma's son convinces her to retract her confession and she's acquitted. Stoner was convicted and sentenced to death, but over 300,000 people felt the vibes were off and signed a petition claiming that Alma coerced him into it. This works and gets Stoner life in prison instead. History goes on to say that Alma can't live with herself anymore, and Romeo and Juliet's a few days after being released from prison by stabbing herself with a dagger 6 times in the chest, 3 of which penetrated her heart, before throwing herself in the river. Apparently, this guy was a farmer and the only witness to this act. 18-year-old Stoner served 7 years of his life sentence and was released to join the army. He makes it through that situation and gets married in 1944 and has a daughter. But Stoner once again gains media attention in his later years. While possibly suffering from Alzheimer's disease, he assaulted a 12-year-old boy in a public restroom in 1990. So Francis Rattenbury's grand story ends with being buried, penniless, in an unmarked grave close to his home. Quite the tale, if I do say. Now, I watch a lot of Murdoch mysteries, and when I read this story, I heard a slightly different version, which I will now share with the utmost respect to the families. Of course, this is for entertainment purposes only. Rattenbury's in Canada, acting straight up wild, thinks he's the man, can do no wrong. We all know the type. But he's buddies with these bigwigs, and he knows a secret or two. Likely, he's in on the big secret. He's told continuously to be cool and knock it off, but he's a narcissist and simply cannot. They threaten him because his nonsense could expose the lie. He threatens them back or simply can't control himself, and he's forcibly sent back to England to be the Queen's problem once again. He's broke now, he's angry, he's cut off from the boys' club, he takes it all out on his wife, he's likely still acting out. England's boys' club's a bit older, more skilled. They plant Stoner in the Rattenbury home, who, by the way, is described as living a largely sheltered life with no friends. The setup comes from the affair with Alma, creating a really good story of why'd they do it. He's contracted to take Francis out, but no one anticipates that Alma really loves the boy. Rattenbury Jr. is in the boys' club, or at least knows a guy, and they convince him to talk some sense into his mom as Stoner's going to take the fall. You see, Alma's not in on the plan, but finds out because she ain't no fool, and starts asking questions. She meets someone at the riverside looking for answers, but they gotta get rid of loose ends. There's no Julia Ogden to do the autopsy. Money exchanges hands. Alma's no longer an issue. Stoner's down not to tell in order to be released. Does his thing for the army, and the rest is history. But of course, that's not what happened. In 2010, the Rattenbury family finally gave Francis a proper headstone, and his legacy lives on all over Western Canada.